Hello, my name is Pedro. I am a level design consultant for Stormcrow. I used to work for Skyblivion, and I am here to teach you about the level designer mindset. Since Navmesh is not my specialty, I have Tyber on hand to go over a bit with why Navmesh is so important for level designers to consider. You will be seeing, or rather hearing him, in a later slide. So, let's say you've been given a prompt from a game writer coming over the quest or lore behind a location if it doesn't have a quest, because either of the which is possible in a open world game such as Skyrim. You might have the thought to immediately jump in, start designing the location, but unfortunately that is not the right way to start. Because in doing so, you are cutting yourself off access to a lot of creative elements you may have come up with otherwise. So, to explain the proper method, I am presenting the path one should take before actually designing the dungeon within this creation kit. So, first off, when you are given the prompt, we are going to second we are going to ask questions about it. So first off, we're to ask what type of level this is. If it's an exterior or an interior, they have various differences about them that they may be similar in some instances, but they have a lot of things that make them unique. Interiors, they're a one cell structure that is comprised solely of assets, where exteriors is a land mesh that connects multiple cells together openly, and you render multiple cells at a time. So understanding which is which creates a different dynamic of what you're going to be using. Understanding if it's a cave, fort, mountain, forest, all these tell you what types of assets you will be using, how often they will be used, and how you can work them together. When we go over things like inhabitants, we talk about natural, artificial, hostile, docile. So we could talk about bears that are going to attack you in a forest. If you want something a little bit wacky, we could have an army of skeevers ambush you from a corpse they were rummaging through, because they're scavengers by nature. We could have a lot of different things come into play to show what this place is occupied by, and how they occupy the location alters the location in some bit, especially in terms of clutter or some pieces of design. If skeevers killed a person and are feeding off of it, there's going to be blood splatter. There's going to be signs of a struggle. There may be a dead skeever because the guy actually managed to fight a bit before he fell to the army of skeevers. And so understanding the inhabitants and their impact on location is also important. And lastly, we're going to consider the backstory. So when a writer gives you a lot of stuff here, there is a lot of information you can glean from it. Some of it might be perfect, and some of it might be, as soon as you look at it, you know what's going on because the writer tells you exactly what's going on. But a lot of things you're going to be thinking about are the things the writer didn't think about, because all the subtle little things that can come from a quest or the background lore can have an impact for the dungeon. And so we talk about what this means for our location. So we talked about how what type of level determines what it's going to be. So let's look at the structure. So let's say you used a cave or some kind of structure like you see in the bottom right corner. This was a cave that I designed for Skyblivion. Unfortunately, the cave it was meant for right now was taken by someone else when I left. So this cave is going to be at another cave in Skyblivion. We do not know what it's going to be. The structure is primarily out of cave assets like cliffs, boulders, pillars, bridge systems. The structure I'm using, the primary structure, however, is mainly natural and artificial. We have signs of a mining operation in play. You see all the little bridges in play, littering a natural cave structure. But then you also see these other crudely designed portions here that look more like a raider settlement. This could be from future occupations of different groups other than the people that initially were there. So we can have generations of impacting a dungeon. And so this is where the backstory really comes into play. You can not just tell about you can just talk about the occupants. But we could talk about more than just the occupants then. We could talk about ones from 3 generations ago, or when this place was used for another set of operations. And this kind of structure can then lead to how we clutter things. Current inhabitants will have a bigger impact on the clutter than previous inhabitants because these are more movable, these are more interactable. These tend to be what you pick up, you move around, you use. So the traps and stuff like this would be the clutter you'd be dealing with. Depending on what type of location, you're going to have different types of flora. You might have in a natural forest that's more temperate, you might have greener flora, while more hardy flora might be done in the harsher, colder environments. So understanding what type of flora grows where is also very important. And again, we can all connect this to backstory. Some mystical elements may provide mystical forms of clutter that will impact the dungeon. So understanding and reviewing these things is heavily important. So let's go over an example. So these are the top 3 points here going over what is being given from a prompt. It's an interior cave that has a Nordic dungeon built within it. Bandits are currently running in it, but the backstory is that it was a Nordic burial tomb built around a ravine. The structure inevitably collapsed. Though it's no longer an intact tomb, bandits have taken refuge in it for their operations. The operation is run by an orc with a penchant for extremely gory forms of torture to those who cross him. So by then we see that this has the makings of a decent dungeon by itself. But what we infer from it can be wildly different from person to person. For example, these are what I gleaned from it. We have the Nordic and cave assets that's determined by the type of level, so that's guaranteed going to be there. The lore tells us this is going to be a ravine, so we should show a ravine in the structure. Um, then since we said that collapse, we're going to show signs of the Nordic architecture breaking down. But now we get to the point where it's inferencing. So since we have bandits running the dungeon, and bandits tend to be a bit more chaotic, my idea was the clutter to be a little bit more haphazard. So things thrown around, things quickly put together so that they have ways of movement around the location, but it's not the best it could be. It's not a city. It's a small operation that may be dismantled at any moment, so why invest too much time in its design? Um, due to the foot traffic where they're going, the main path you're going to be going through would not have much natural elements because most natural elements would have been stomped out, broken apart, and you'd probably see a lot more natural portions on the sidelines. Because we have bandits owning the location now, you're going to see a lot less natural lighting in certain areas unless it's not frequented by bandits. So for the main path, you'd be talking more about man-made lights, torches, campfires, bonfires. If you have mages there, you might be using some mage light spells. And then you need to start thinking about how the background from the past and the current area are interacting with each other a bit more. So we talk about how the bandit structure may be interacting with the natural structure or the structure of the ancient Nords. So we can start thinking about things like that. And then because of the orc bandit chief, that's a bit gory, sadistic, and all that, we might have corpses littering the area, blood splatter, covering walls, because this guy is not a fellow that just finishes done. He likes to play with his food a bit. And so just that small little backstory, the prompt that's given here under the backstory can give us a lot of information what we can do. Stuff that we might not have considered if we just started the creation kit and started placing assets. So by analyzing the prompts, we can do a good bit. But from there, we have to actually start the design. So one of the things we can do here is draw out a plan. The creation kit's a very involved set of multiple assets. So before we start placing 3D assets, why don't we draw a basic ground plan? As you see here, I used a Microsoft Paint document to help How to Be an Emperor design their library. As it was standing beforehand, a lot of people that tried the library was unable to give it a decent design because they did not conceptualize the library beforehand. So managing the 3D space was a bit difficult, especially in a circular environment. So this simplistic paint image here, where I've put multiple lines, and that's pretty much it, gave us a simplistic base point that we could determine all the basic structures. And from this, clutter becomes more natural. We're able to do a lot more, and a lot of time was saved rather than wasted doing countless revisions on this library interior. And because of this, a lot of the progress in this was in part by talking with my 3D, the 3D person behind it, Kazuhide. He designed the entire Imperial Palace. So by talking with the 3D designer, I was able to glean a bit more information, understand what he was envisioning. I talked to the writing people about what their story was talking about, how important the library was, and how frequented it was. And then I talked with the level designer responsible for the library at the time, and together we all came to the conclusion of this base piece, and the library was much easier to handle. So communication is heavily important to get through things, especially if you're stuck on something. Communication can be the difference between you stuck on something for months or a simple day. Now, when we finally get to the creation kit, you may be tempted to just mess around with tiles and then placing things on said tiles. But tiles are not the best way to go about things in certain cases, especially in an interior setting or even an exterior setting, especially because exteriors have much more restrictions. So understanding what you're messing around with in an exterior landscape would have other implications. So one of the skills you're going to be learning is that assets are not just what they say on the label. All right. A column is not just a column. It can be an extension to a cliff. It could be the side piece of a wall jutting out. It can be a lot of different things depending on how you're using it. It can be a slope. It could be a platform. It could be so much. But the limit is your creativity on it. When assets by themselves cannot do the job, kit bashing assets together can. And for instance, we talked about rocks and pillars here. If you see any bit of my caves, if we go back and you saw that little cave structure I made, that was kit bashing cliffs, walls, rocks, dirt mounds, pillars. All of that went together just to make that structure. And by kit bashing, we can create things that a standard Bethesda dungeon could not accomplish. You can do the same thing with mountain assets, even if it's not in a mountain. If you've seen some of Isaac's level designing, he prefers to use mountainscapes within his interior dungeons. And it makes his dungeons stand out from dungeons that I do. And for people in a domestic sense, we've been able to kit bash furniture. As long as the furniture is in the same kind of set. So noble furniture in Skyrim can be clipped together in certain ways. In this image right here, we see multiple shelving units put in place, but this is about 10 different assets being clipped together to make this structure here. It's not just one legendary or one hero asset. It's a group of assets that are arranged together in such a way that it comes off as a hero asset. And learning kit bashing can save both you and your 3D designer's time because it allows you to make more unique creations that a 3D designer does not have to work on. And that can be very important. So, going from that portion, we need to understand that back to the writing portion, that a writer's perspective is not going to be everything at a level because a level design is a cooperation of multiple fields. You have your quest people having an impact, you have your writers having an impact, and you have you having an impact. A story by itself is just a book. All right, some notes sprawled around a dungeon. What brings it to life are having the quests run through it and the scene being in place. And since we're building the scene, we have a massive part in the structure altogether. What we glean from the prompts, what we glean from the quests, can be different from what they're expecting, but it's not unwelcome in a lot of cases. If it's unwelcome, they should tell you about it and you talk it through. But compromise is a big thing because the collaboration of multiple people allow for a more unique dynamic being put in place. The story might have more impact if the scene is changed a little bit differently than what the quest designer had in mind. So everyone here has a part. So what we talk about here, what we gleaned here, we can apply it to a certain quest in the Thieves Guild. If you did a lot of the side thieving jobs in the Thieves Guild, you were given the task to go to Markarth to talk to a silversmith. He wanted you to get a silver mold that was in delivery, but the delivery was attacked by bandits, and you were tasked to get the mold from the bandit operation. When you get to the operation, there's a lot of level designing done in place to show the extent of the operation, but a lot of the bandit leader's personality is put into the dungeon. If there was just a book telling you the person was paranoid, it'd be lackluster. But we have towards the treasure room multiple traps, blood showing signs of there's a reason behind her paranoia, and multiple threatening letters throughout the dungeon telling them, do not get near my stash, you've already had your cut. This environmental storytelling is very important to cooperate with the storytelling because doing so reinforces the dungeon a bit. It makes it more immersive, it makes the player more interested, it makes the player feel like they're actually experiencing the story instead of having the story shoved down their throat. So we can do so much with our design to support what's been written and what's been implemented. And now that we've talked about the things that we can put together, we need to talk about what our limitations are because sometimes we get a little too big for our britches. All right. The creation engine is by no means a free for all. You have your limits. Every engine has their limits, whether you're looking at the creation engine, the Unity engine, the Unreal engine, countless other game development engines. They all have limits. You can see it to be, in terms of the engine, how many assets can it handle? How many polys could it handle? How optimized are the locations? So what's being rendered all at once can have a massive impact on the engine. The more that's being rendered, the harder the PC is being run. And if the engine is handling it, but the PC can't, that's another issue. So we have to deal with optimization and making sure that as many people can experience the location you've designed as possible. Then we can start talking about lighting in this instance, because lighting has its own limitations as well within the engine. In the creation kit, only 4 normal lighting things can be interacting on the same nitride shape of a mesh at a time. This includes a player's torch or a mage light spell. You may have gone through a dungeon in Skyrim where you've opened up a torch and everything you're walking around starts flickering. This is a common bug when more than 4 light sources are in play, and it tends to not just ruin immersion, but it makes it really hard to see much detail in a cave. So when we're designing a location, we have to understand that these lights need to be placed in such a way where they reveal the scene well. They might draw our attention to something important. They may just let us know where we're going, see where we're going. But at the same time, we can't put too much lights in one area, or else we run into multiple difficulties. And because of this, we can also expand and talk about how far an asset has been resized. If something is too large, it's still one nitride shape for that one texture base. So if multiple light sources are hitting an enlarged asset, it still has the same limitations. So you have to understand that if you resize an asset, you still have the same limits for that asset, which can change an entire dynamic. And then we're going to get to the point of, is it playable? We've talked about the limits of the engine, but can the AI in the engine handle it? Or can you handle it? Can you run through the dungeon? We tell people that we want cluttered dungeons, but there's no such thing as too much clutter. If the player cannot run through the dungeon, then it's a set piece. If NPCs can't run through the dungeon, it's a glorified piece of exploration. That's all this will end up being. So we need to understand that we need to make the location playable. So we need to know our limits in this area as well. And for not just pathing of us, but pathing of NPCs, we need to talk a little bit about Navmesh. And Navmesh is going to be the navigation mesh that NPCs will be traveling on. And before we get too heavy into Navmesh, I'm going to say one thing about the limitations of dungeons. Based off of what has been given to you in terms of a dungeon, we might make something that's too big or too small. If we were given a camp, we're not going to make a location as big as Sarthal. But if we are told to make a massive bastion, we are not going to give them a broken hovel. So the size is really important for us to think about as well. If we go too far in terms of size not being in line with the story, the background, and the overall emphasis of many of the points, it's not going to reflect well altogether, because in order for something to be great, everything has to work together. You have to have story writing in line with your level design, in line with your quest design, in line with the implementation. Everything has to work together to get those amazing things. In the previous presentation done by Ria, they talked about Whodunit being an amazing quest. Well, part of the reason why that quest was amazing was not just the story elements, but the fact that there was so many little nooks and crannies and how many people moved around. Everything was working together. The level was designed to optimally give the player the ability to do what they were told to do. The NPCs gossiped about each other, so the story really supported the quest background. These people were not just there for a reward, they were there to gossip about each other. And in doing so, makes it easier for you to manipulate them. All these little elements come together. and we have to do our part to make sure ours is up to par and works with the concepts overall. So now I'm going to go back to Navmesh, and we're going to let Tyber take the reins here, because he is much more skilled in Navmesh than I am, and he is going to knock it out of the park.
I hope I can live up to that level of speaking there. But hey, I'm Tyber. I'm, I suppose, primarily a Navmesher on Skyblivion, and I've spent, God, months now, since last year, just Navmeshing every day. I have some like 700 cells of Cyrodiil under my belt now. So I've spent quite a bit of time with these spread triangles. So Navmesh. So just to get the point across, Navmesh, broadly speaking, is this data structure used in various games since the early 2000s to provide the AI essentially a map to find pathways from one point to another in any particular level. It's not something that is unique to Creation Kit. I've often found people pointing to Navmesh in the Creation Kit as if it is solely a Skyrim problem. No, Navmesh exists in many games. It exists in Unity. It exists in the Unreal Engine. Merely what the problem is just how well the Navmesh is drawn. So Navmesh is often given a bad rep because a lot of level designers see it as this tedious task that comes at the end of all the fun of designing a level after you've cluttered, after you've put the creatures in, after you've like made all sorts of pathways, and now okay, so then you basically have to make this basic outline of your level. So the AI do not see like you and I do. They cannot tell there is a rock in my path. There is a tree over there. There is a path going up to the left and down to the right. They're completely blind, and it is the Navmesh, which appears as a series of red triangles in the Creation Kit. Basically, they only see this, and is through the cover system that marks certain objects, like a wall as white or a rock as blue, that tells them, oh, I can hide behind this rock. I can lean against this wall to get out of the way of a player or his archery. Really, it is up to the level designer to help the AI out as much as possible. And I often see level designers, like whether they're working on their own project or working on a big project, they kick it off to somebody else because it can be a tedious task to just basically draw over your entire level. The bigger it is, the more Navmesh there has to be. But I cannot emphasize enough how important the Navmesh is. And it really is up to the level designer to do their own Navmesh, because they are the ones that understand the level the most. They are the ones that have an idea, a goal in mind that they have set, that they want. They know the experience they want the player to have in this particular level, and they can get that point across. Well, they can augment that point if they understand Navmesh and how it can benefit them. Because Navmesh is essentially the lifeblood of Skyrim modding, really. It is, as I said, it gives the AI their map of the world. It also gives them functionality. You can write the most compelling quests. You can sculpt the most fearsome creatures. You can script the most fluid animation. Well, none of that is going to matter if the AI can't function. So I don't have images of a particular level, unfortunately, of a cave or a dungeon, but up on the screen here is the most recent Navmesh that I drew for the Hot Bay project, How to Be an Emperor. I don't know how well you can see it, but this is a very optimized Navmesh that I drew with cover drawn for the first 3 floors of the Imperial Palace. Takes into account the stairs, all the pillars, the torches and benches. And this is really what the AI sees. It does not see the grandiose design. It when it comes down to it, this is what they see. And when the player is anywhere within these red triangles, that that is the center of their world to them. Yeah, sorry, thank you. So what's really important to the level designer is the cover system. So the cover system, there is an automatic function for the level designer to take advantage of that can get it drawn in a flash. Basically, the creation kit looks at all of the objects that you've drawn around in, all of the sides, basically the empty holes that I've laid there, where there are benches, there are pillars, there's a table in the center, as you know, in the Imperial Palace. It takes into account their shape, their collision, the size, and it says, okay, it calculates a value between 0 and I believe it's 244. How much cover do these objects give the AI? And based on that value, the AI, during a fight, say if I started fighting the Imperial Guard here in the council room, the AI, the guards, for example, like depending on their weaponry, they'll say, oh, I have a bow. I need to get the best cover possible. And they will look at the Navmesh and they will say, okay, the best possible cover has a white border, which has the value of just maximum cover. And they will try to make their way to that cover. Or if there isn't any white cover, they'll go to the blue edges that have the value of 244 or 240, 236. They will just make their way to the highest value possible. And while people often use the draw cover as like a one and done sort of functions, like, hey, how fast can I quickly get this done and move on, because it's not nearly as fun as cluttering. The level designer can take advantage of this because they can still draw cover manually. You can select the edges of the Navmesh and assign it a value. And so not so much here in the Imperial Palace, but in a actual dungeon, in a cave, you can take advantage of that and direct the AI to points on the map where you want them to maybe provide a better fight for the player. Perhaps you have an overhang. I'm sorry, no, look better yet. How about you have a treasure near the middle of this particular room? And obviously it's out in the open, the player sees it, and their first instinct is to run towards it. Well, maybe you want to have some higher cover above them, like in the roof. Maybe you have like some goblin tunnels that open up in the ceiling. And so you can place the AI there, and you can have the rare drop-down point, where the AI are told from a higher level that, hey, this edge is safe to jump down from. It is safe, and you're not going to die. And they will drop down and surprise the player to ambush them. Or perhaps you have a ledge off to the side. And you know what? You want the AI to take advantage of that. You want them to, maybe they spawn somewhere else, but you want them to make their way over there, take advantage of that height, switch to their bows. While the player is engaged with a heavier target, then you can do that. You can set that ledge cover. You can set that cover as a higher value so that the AI will make their way towards it. A good instance in Skyblivion in the last few months, one of the level designers and I were looking at this series of cliffs. Basically, you had a winding staircase up a mountain. And we were joking how in vanilla Skyrim, if we ever got in trouble running into highway bandits, and oh no, we're losing health. Well, we'll just slide down the side, jump from rock to rock, down the side of the cliff. And the AI, well, they can't do much about that. They'll stare at you angrily. Maybe they will start running down the looping pathway to still get to you, and you'll just laugh because you're just sliding down the mountain. Whereas here, we decided to experiment with drop-down points, and we were able to make a series of them such that when we jumped off the side of this cliff, the AI were able to safely transverse straight down the mountainside and immediately be on us and kill us. And I haven't felt my blood pump like that in quite a while because I know so much about Navmesh, and I know oh, for example, the AI in Skyrim can't jump. I know, oh, if I just jump on a high enough rock, the AI can't get to me. They'll stare angrily at me. Maybe they'll start doing that thing where they run backwards for a good long while staring at me, because it confuses them. We have stepped off the Navmesh at that point, and we may as well have just phased through a solid wall. We are now in just empty space to them. We do not exist. And it is my goal in Skyblivion and any other project I work on that I want the AI to reach their maximum capability. That's how I think of it. It's not as a tedious job, but I want, it might be a little sadistic, but I want the enemy to chase myself or the player as hard as possible. I don't want the player to be able to get away so easily. I want them to have the most challenging experience possible. I want them to, if the difficulty is that easy, as we know on like Adept Skyrim, where you're basically a god already at level 5, then I want them to work for it. The AI will chase you as far as they are allowed to go. This right here is the, so in the Hot Bay project, we've added several new floors to the Imperial Palace. Here on the left side, we have the Emperor's private baths and chambers. And I don't know who, but someone, to save time, tried to auto-generate the Navmesh rather than hand draw it. I will say, while Navmesh exists across multiple engines, across multiple decades, the auto-generation of the creation kit is lacking. It is in no way, shape, or form as accurate as modern engines like Unreal. And especially when it comes to it, while in the landscape it is passable and you can play around with the settings, on interiors it is extremely lacking. So if you can see on the left side, the Navmesh is extremely broken. In fact, it's not quite well seen, but the Navmesh going from the bottom floor to the upper floor is in fact broken. So if there are any quests involving these two floors, so maybe the Emperor takes a bath and then decides to walk up the staircase, he's not going to be able to make it to his room, not going to be able to make it to his private study. The AI is going to be infinitely trapped there. Perhaps you can use console commands, perhaps you can summon him across the gap, but if the Navmesh is broken, basically, if the two triangles have yellow borders, it means they're not connected. If they share a dark red border, then they are shared. The AI is never going to get across. You've essentially broken the immersiveness of your quest line. If, say, you're talking to him up on that staircase, and he gets that line and he's still talking, but for whatever reason, he's stopped altogether, then there's not much to do. Like I said, you can have the most beautiful, well-decorated level design, and hey, I'm sure the screen archers out there will love you for it. You could have a level truly worth being in Unreal Engine 5. But if your level cannot function, then I'm sorry, then the level is pretty much worthless in large projects that we often find ourselves in. You should really think not what your level can do for you, but what you can do for your level in making sure that you have the most optimized, the most far-reaching Navmesh that you can. It doesn't need to cover every crevice, every pathway, like every bump in the road has to be well covered. You just need to provide the tools from which your AI can maximize their capabilities. Basically, they just need to be able to get everywhere they can. Any markers, furniture markers, alchemy tables. I'm forgetting the word there for them, but they just need to be able to reach everywhere they can, and you need to take that into account. Do not, I implore you, do not kick it to someone else and say, my job is done. I've made a beautiful level. As long as the AI can transverse and they know where they're going, then you've already covered yourself pretty well with Navmesh, but a great level designer will take into account Navmesh and augment their level beyond what is typically produced. That's pretty much it.
All right. To bring all of this together, we have just a better close-up about what was going on here. The blue here designates water Navmesh. This is a special type of Navmesh. We have multiple different colors, different paths. This is just telling it he's bathing in the water. Lastly, we're going to go over some practice here because we talked about a lot of concepts that you have to consider before doing a dungeon. So before we do any actual structural building, I would like to give y'all a prompt to expand on. We give you the location Cracked Skull Lookout here, and I want you to tell me what type of location is it going to be, what are its inhabitants, and what does this background mean for the level overall. If you believe that's not enough to challenge you, we can talk about what challenges this can bring to optimization and Navmesh, because every location has those challenges. So for the next 10 minutes, why don't we do this as a practice exercise for everyone? During this time, we can also ask questions while people are doing practice.
Also, we have a question from Constantine, real quick. How about using the AToNavmesh generator and then start customizing from there? Is it viable?
It's one method, but it's for exteriors, it's probably a bit more effective, and in interiors, it might be more time wasted, to be honest. Tyber can give you more information on that regard.
What was the question?
He said, what about auto-generating the Navmesh and then editing it from there?
Right, that is viable. It is the most viable in that we often do that in Skyblivion. We auto-generate it and then try to work from there. It's passable. Interiors, though, I've seen firsthand. Oh, just interior auto-generation is just particularly bad from what I've seen. The landscape, you can do it, but from interior, you can do it, but oftentimes it's so broken, so what's the right word? Piecemeal, if that's the correct word. It's so like broken up into we call them islands. If you see these separate portions of Navmesh not connected together, they're called islands. That oftentimes it can be just quicker, just starting from hand, just starting fresh. But in landscape, I would say there's some settings that you can set to get pretty good auto generation that just need a few hand touch-ups. But in interiors, it's not so good. There is a project going on to create a third-party auto generator using the same libraries as Unreal Engine called TriWizard that I'm currently overseeing. That will hopefully fix this problem. But I would highly recommend for an interior, you might as well just start fresh. Especially, I didn't say it, but it seems like the obvious. It's like the more complex your level is, the more complex the Navmesh is going to be, especially taking into account the collision of various objects. It's not often like brought up, but you can use F4 on your, I believe that's the default hotkey for, you can turn on a view to see the collision of your level. So it'll show you basically like the grid system of like, here's the collision for all the rocks, the trees, just all the stuff in the level. And I use that to sometimes get an idea, because sometimes the collision for objects is just generalized. It's not very accurate. Just to save data, not necessarily like, oh, that's a bad collision for the object. But especially when, say, perhaps you want to take a decent sized rock and you want to blow it up, as I've often seen, say, Pedro or really Isaac. I've seen them like enlarge some of the vanilla rocks in order to use it like as part of some kind of like large mountainscape or whatever, and that's fine. But the collision, which before it was generalized and you would have never noticed just running along the Whiterun plains. Now, as a giant piece of a mountain that you're scaling, it's pretty noticeable when you're actually floating between two portions and you're just floating in the air. I would take that into account because the auto generation is also trying to take into account the collision of all the objects. It's not really taking into account the shape of the objects. It's just all over the place. I'm sorry, I hope I answered the original question.
You did. To the question of why triangles are used, this is a geometry question. 3 points are the maximum amount of points you can place that guarantee a plane is being used. And since Navmesh is a system of planes that NPCs are using to walk on, or know that they're walking on, that's the reason why triangles are used.
And it's red just because it's supposed to be a very highly visible color. There are other colors within the Navmesh, both the edges and the actual triangle itself. I didn't know if I figured this wasn't the place really to cover that. But but Pedro, you pointed out that blue center, blue is water. That's and water Navmesh honestly is a bit of a different ball game. It's got different physics rules on what it tells the AI. Basically, it tells them there's water, but then it also enables them, if it's true, if there's a water plane, then it allows them to swim up and down, not just side to side. It can get quite confusing. You're going to need to pull we're going to need to pull one of your diagrams with the x-axis on, and I feel like that's better saved for another
everyone
lecture.
gets confused on. Yeah.
Yes.
We can do that at some other point on a dedicated Navmesh tutorial.
Yeah. In fact, Navmesh and its colors have evolved. So since Skyrim came out in Fallout 4, there's actually several other types of Navmesh, like gray Navmesh, which actually tells creatures of a certain size where they can and can't go, which is actually pretty interesting, but that does not exist in Skyrim's Navmesh. So I'll actually be interested to see if in the creation kit 2 for Starfield, if they further develop it.
All right. Now that we've had these questions here, before anyone asks anything, does anyone want to give their ideas of what this means for the location based off the description I've given? You could type it or you can speak out loud.
I think I would try. So this sounds like it's going to be an exterior. So it's not like a cave. It's more like one of those towers that you can see in Skyrim. For example, near Skyhaven Temple, this Forthorn camp or location, or even Red Eagle Tower, where it's a former fortress from some sort of Nords, perhaps even just soldiers that have been overtaken by Forthorn, and where they have added their, let's call it their special touch of furnituring things. So you would see different, first of all, fairly rudimentary fortifications, like logs that have been sharpened to serve as defenses. But you would also see small lookout towers made out of wood. The fourth one usually either use wood or like leather tents and bones for their, not really tie sets, but for their fortifications and their modifications to the land. And I think generally it would be on some sort of either cliff or on a small hill, just to get the whole lookout thing good, so that they actually have space to see from.
It's not bad, but let me challenge you with this. How would they get up there? Would there be an outside path, or will we use a interior path to get up to the peak? So it could be a combination of exterior and interior.
That's true. Yeah, you could either go through like a small cave to the peak. Obviously, the cave would be fortified as well, or just, I don't know, guarded. But you also might as well just have a central, let's call it a central main door or main gate that's heavily fortified and heavily guarded. Maybe even with some traps or some spikes. and that way that you could just enter the building through the it's called intended way, and then make your way up the tower, either around or go in serpentines up.
Fair.
And on the top, you would probably have your Heckraven and your Briarhearts. Probably some, not really alchemical, probably some more shaman-like or alchemical clutter. So an alchemy bench, maybe an altar, where the Heckraven would prepare the Briarhearts for their ritual of undeath. And some, I guess, a few storage areas for pelts and meat.
All right. Does anyone else have any other descriptions than Hendris? Gamma has brought up dead goats because it is a typical thing for Forsworn. Now, here's the thing I posted. They said they sent out people to gather reagents and to kidnap an enchanter. I never said it was done. I never said it was in progress. So the number of enemies could be varying as well. And the people at the location could vary. There could be more Forsworn present. There could be less Briarhearts present because they might be out in the field doing what's needed for their operation. But because it's a little bit open-ended here, this allows a lot more interpretation for the level designer to mess around with. So let's say fighting an entire army of Forsworn is too much for a player to fight, especially with 3 Briarhearts and a Hagraven fighting you all at once. If some of the groups are still on patrol, that can reduce the number of Briarhearts currently at the location, but you can see them in tangential locations with ties to that operation. So there's a lot of ways we can bring out this information.
I thought of a camp of or fort of silver bloods and a path leading to it. Like one part of the quest could, like not quest, would be like the Forsworn ambushing there.
Sign of where the enchanter was going to.
Yeah, the enchanter could pass through the path, and then like a close, and then like there could be a Forsworn camp overlooking the Silver Blood Forter camp, like spying. Like they've been preparing for days, I guess, for this encounter.
I would probably say
something
months,
like that. But yeah, but a problem will be the like you said, cliffs and rocks. This,
you call it an issue with Navmesh, definitely. At the same time,
yeah, that will be like a really hard, like the hardest part, I guess.
Yeah.
Like,
Another part here in optimization is because of those rocks and cliff assets needing to be used to create a proper path, it can cause frame rate issues. So what can be recommended is to throw occlusion planes within the cave, within not just the cave path or anything like that you're doing, but actually inside the cliffs. Because in doing so, anything behind the cliff does not get rendered. Anything from your angle that intersects the plane on your path of seeing will not get rendered. You can optimize it to where you can have hundreds of assets on this cliff to make it look realistic, but at one time only 20 of those assets are being shown and being rendered at one point. So having all these little things here is very important.
Could I take a moment to answer a Navmesh question?
Yeah, after that we're going to have to close up.
Yeah, so I just want to answer Constantine, who asked, does Navmesh affect performance? If I were to map out a certain area to the nitty-gritty detail, would the game perform worse than if I were to do something far simpler? So overall, like if we're talking about like frame rate, probably not. It would make very little impact. But if you want to get down to it, yes, there is actually an impact. So whether it's highly detailed or not, I would say that the AI would still function the same way. But better optimization allows for better runtime efficiency and allows the level designer to see in where an actor really can squeeze through gaps without worrying about the AI radius. If you're familiar with basic 3D models, then let's think of it Navmesh as like, well, what really is it's navigational. It's a navigational mesh, and let's think of its vertices as polygons. The more polygons there are, the more detailed the model is. With more triangles, the Navmesh presumably takes account of every. Let's say, the more accurate the Navmesh is, presumably it takes account to every bump, every perfection in the area. And the AI presumably has a more accurate, detailed map of the ground, and therefore it can calculate many more routes and pathways. But on the flip side of that, the more triangles there are in the cell, the more time it takes for the AI to read the map, to understand its surroundings, to to calculate suitable pathways. Like a high poly mesh, more RAM is dedicated to loading it. The file size of the ESP is increased when saved. In fact, I think I made a post once a while back on the Skyblivion updates about I cut from a Navmesh file. I cut some 120,000 triangles, and the size of the file more than half was reduced. And references. So Navmesh, I believe, are temporary references within Skyrim. Temporary references are loaded when the player is within a certain area, but it does contribute to the overall reference limit of Skyrim. So that's like the number of objects that you can put into game, new objects you can put into game before Creation Kit just no longer works. It no longer functions because you've added just too much to the Creation Kit. So, yes, Navmesh does affect performance. It may not be in the same way of like if I dropped in a 1 million poly dragon, but it does affect performance, and you're better off with optimization.
Before Nugamentum does his stuff, I would like to thank everyone for being here, and I hope this has been of help to everyone here. If there's any other questions during this time when Nugamentum is starting up, I'll stay in lecture hall chat and answer as many questions as possible. Thank you for having me.